I hope today that, I hope you'll walk away with a few things today. One is just kind of a basic appreciation for what economic impact analysis is, how you use it, that kind of thing. I would love it if you guys were sort of informed consumers, which means to say that you're able to see somebody else's study and understand if it was done correctly, and if it was done correctly, what the results mean, and maybe where you should ask more questions if necessary. And then finally, my third hope for the day is that one or more of you will actually do one of these analysis and make it part of your professional career to kind of undertake this sort of analysis as you go. And we'll talk about some reasons why you might do that in the future. I just want to set that as the stage. So today, trying to advance my slide here, not having, there we go. So today, this is what we're going to talk about. There's two different types of analysis, economic and fiscal. We're going to talk about the difference between those two things. We're going to say why you might choose to do one, the different reasons why you might do it, some key terms that are the terms of art, and some issues that you might run into and some mistakes you might want to avoid, how you actually undertake one of these things, and then some options for you to consider in terms of models. And as we've done in the previous few instances, I'll talk for roughly 30 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more, but we're going to save a lot of time at the end for your questions, for individual places where you've seen this or any comments that you might have. So just think about that as we go along. I'm also happy to take questions as we go. In fact, I love that. It's a little bit more interactive that way, so feel free to do so. And so with that, are there any questions before we start? There being none. All right. So economic and fiscal impact analysis. Quite simply, economic impact analysis is about economies. So it's not tied to a specific political boundary. It's about anything related to how goods and services are traded. We measure three specific things: jobs, wages, or earnings, depending on how you call it, and output or sales. So how many people are employed, what they're making, and then how much total business activity is associated with that. On the other hand, fiscal impact studies are very much about political boundaries, and they're about tax revenue, and they're about what is this town going to get in property tax revenue, or associated revenues of personal property tax, or whatever the particular circumstances are around that community, what they get in tax revenue and what they have in expenditures. We're not really going to cover this, but sometimes people get those two confused. And of course, there's all kinds of other impacts that are not included in economic impact. And I list some of them on the slide, like social impacts or environmental impacts or cultural impacts and so on like that. And kind of the joke I always like to say about this is, if everything were about economics and economic impacts, none of us would have any children. We would just, enjoy life, right? There obviously are considerations beyond economics, and we understand them, but we're just looking at the economics. Here is why you might do an economic impact study. There's a bunch of different reasons. I've over my career have done multiple projects under each of these categories, and they're a little bit, some of them overlap a little bit, but they're important to understand why you might do this. One of them is you have a deal and someone is asking for an incentive, and the community has to give something up. And you say, what are we getting for what are we giving up, right? That's an economic impact study result that you can use for that discussion. Sometimes to help sell a project for a community. Someone might be concerned about the traffic, right, as an example, or whatever it is. Or there's some concerns about the project, and you can say, by doing the study, you can say, well, here are the benefits of the project. Here's what we get out of it. And so it helps inform that discussion. Sometimes we'll have it with respect to, like, what are some long-term impacts from a planning point of view? I listed, loss of a major employer. We had one community that lost a hospital, and they were really concerned that in addition to the, I think 400 or so jobs at the hospital itself, they were concerned about how many other jobs were going to be lost in the community and what they should do to prepare for that eventuality. So sometimes in a regulatory review, for example, if anybody's run into NEPA or a state environmental review, sometimes requires this. Sometimes you actually have to do this. And then finally, there is, well, actually not finally, there's the mitigation thing. You could say, well, we're going to have a traffic impact, but it's sort of offset by all these great economic impacts. And then finally, we have this last bullet point, which is, I'm not going to go into it, but there's actually a way to use the economic impact tools to identify what your economic base is and what might be missing from your economy. If you have like several businesses that are maybe purchasing an input, but that input doesn't exist in your economy, there's a way to figure out what that is and maybe potentially recruit that business. All right, any questions so far? Okay, good. So, key terms to understand. The easiest one is the first one is direct effects, okay? What are the jobs that are happening at the project itself? The project being, you know, maybe you have a new business come into town, right? So what are the jobs and wages of that business, and what are the sales that are going to happen to the business? Now, for the purpose of modeling, you really only need one of those inputs. It's great to have more than one, but you really only need one: jobs, wages, or output change. Tourism, we're finding a lot of folks want to have tourism as something that they study.
Okay, so maybe we put this to next month.
Even's okay. Yeah.
That's fine.
I'm sorry, we have somebody talking in the background. I don't know who it is. Is it Shauna?
Yes.
Shauna, could you put your phone on mute, please?
This is a display, yeah.
So why is this such?
Okay, I'm gonna try to do this.
Andre, you can. Andre, you should be able to mute folks if you can see.
My big deal is when we go to the legislative breakfast and talk to all these senators and legislators, especially now that we're getting more involved.
Oh boy.
Everyone else has these wonderful displays, and we have like the cardboard high
Donna,
school.
can you hear us? Mute your
So
phone.
why don't we just make a decision to just do? They're like $350.
Well, yeah,
Right, well,
Not that much.
Right, so Mark is designing it.
But do you have to do?
Andre, if you go to Shauna and right
Yeah.
click on the microphone, you should be able to mute that.
I think we need to put kind of our mission and some photos of
Or maybe Michael, you might be able to do
so the
that.
display that we
I'm
have.
trying to do that right now, and I'm not able to do that.
Yeah.
It kind of
I'm on
talks about
I'm on her,
where these photos come from.
Participant list, and it's not working for me here.
Okay.
How about that?
Oh, perfect. All right, she's muted now. Wonderful. Okay, we'll continue then. All right, so for tourism, there's kind of an extra wrinkle in here, and I just want to make sure people understand this. You might have, for example, an amusement park or I don't know what, a NASCAR racetrack or something like that, and there's a bunch of jobs at the site. Let's say there's 50 jobs at the site, but tourism is a special deal. You have, you know, the people working at the site, but because they have all these new dollars coming in with the tourists that might be spending at restaurants and hotels and that kind of thing, there's a bunch of spending that's happening offsite and a bunch of jobs that are created offsite, but they're still direct jobs. There are, you know, jobs directly associated with the casino or with the racetrack or whatever it is, okay? So that tourism can be kind of a special case. Indirect effects are business-to-business purchases, okay? Which means to say, whatever new dollars are coming into the economy, that business has to purchase inputs. So if you have a tool manufacturer, you know, they may have to buy steel. So steel is the input. They have to buy steel from the local steel producer. That's an input into. So it's business-to-business purchases. The example I give here is the office occupant. Maybe they have to buy janitorial services or legal services or whatever it is, but business-to-business. Induced effects are more about wages. So a new business comes to town, it hires a bunch of people, it pays them a bunch of wages. Now they're spending those wages in the economy. They're going to grocery stores and buying their groceries. They're going to the laundromat. They're going to the, you know, to whatever it is, and they're spending their money locally, and that's also new money that kind of circulating through, okay? So the combination of those things, the direct benefits, the indirect business-to-business, and the induced wages, right, are the total economic impacts. When we say what are the economic impacts, it's the total of all three of those things. A lot of times people talk about multipliers, and someone might say, well, this industry's got a 2.5 multiplier for jobs. What does that mean? it means for every 1 job created at the site, there's 1.5 jobs created off-site, and together that makes 2.5 jobs. And so we say if we have 100 jobs on site and the multiplier is 2.5, that means the total job change is 250 jobs. Now, there are multipliers for jobs, there's multipliers for wages, and there's multipliers for output, sales, right? If the business is going to do $100,000 in business, and there's a 2 multiplier, that means it's a total change in the economy of $200 million, or whatever the number is. And we'll get into the models, and I'll talk a little bit more about multipliers and other factors later on. But I just want to give you the overlay of what some of these terms are. There's a couple of other like technical terms that you don't really need to know. You have to understand the concept behind them, but just in case you hear exogenous change, all it means, exo means out of, so coming out of genus, coming out of change. So it's coming from outside the area, money coming in. That's the source of our impact, of our direct impacts, is money's coming from outside the community into the community. Usually that happens when you have an exporter who's exporting goods outside of the community. Dollars from outside the community are flowing back to the manufacturer, back to the exporter. And those new dollars create new job opportunities. We're going to talk a lot about net new. So in the case of New Hampshire, if New Hampshire is our geography of interest, if we're saying we want to know what's the impact on New Hampshire, but this can apply if you want to look at just your county or maybe multiple counties, maybe just your region, it applies to the same thing. We first want to look at what's the job, what are the dollars that are coming from outside New Hampshire into New Hampshire because of your project. Net new. Before we go any further, we have to have a nice long discussion, and I warn you, there is a quiz that's coming up. You have to understand what is net new, and it's not necessarily as simple as that sounds. Net new is the single biggest pitfall that I see on a fairly regular basis, even from sometimes sophisticated users, of not correctly calculating what the net new is. Net new is a second bullet point. It's the change in final demand. It's the change in the economy once you have eliminated and accounted for all other changes. All right? If you take nothing else away from this conversation, this is the most important part. Before you can have an economic impact, you have to have net new. Okay? We're going to come up in the quiz in just a minute, so you got to pay attention to this part. Here are the kind of questions that you may have to ask to understand this key idea of net new. How will this project affect other employers? So let's say you have a business in your community, and that business produces widgets, and you attract a new widget manufacturer to your community. If the new widget manufacturer puts the old widget manufacturer out of business and takes their business away, what's the economic impact? 0, right? There's no economic impact. You have the same number of jobs producing the same amount of goods, okay? What if we're just selling all this stuff to ourselves? So you have a new guy that comes in, sets up a convenience store, sets up a local retail, but you're basically only selling within your community, and people could purchase it someplace else in your community. Is that really net new? Not dollars coming in from the outside. It's just dollars that are already in your community. You're not creating new dollars there, okay? Tourism, again, a lot of people want to understand the effects of tourism. And the example we give is people don't visit the Grand Canyon because of the new hotel. Like there's this great new hotel, we're going to go visit the Grand Canyon because the hotel is there. They're at the hotel because of the Grand Canyon. So if your tourism project is a destination that people are coming to your community to see, to participate in, to be active with, that's net new. But if it's the ice cream shop that's serving the existing tourism base, that's not net new. You're not attracting new tourists or visitors to your community. And there's all kinds of examples of tourism/visitor type of venues that you wouldn't think of as net new that are, and other ones that you might think of as net new that really aren't. So you have to think about, you have to give some mental thought about this, right? Then one of the big ones, this applies particular to manufacturing, but there's other industries it applies to, is how much activity of this business is actually happening here. So you might have a new automobile dealer in your community, and they're going to do $10 million in sales. But of course, almost all of that money is to purchase the cars that they resell, and they're only adding on the margin. So $9 million of that $10 million in your community is actually leaving it to go to Detroit or go to Tokyo or whatever, where these manufacturing, or Mexico, where the manufacturing is actually happening. And you're getting just the local margin. And then finally, one way to think about this that I find helpful is, if this business went away, what would happen? So what is at risk by this business not coming here? Okay? Any questions about that so far? Anybody want to talk about this before we move on to the quiz? Any other examples that you want to talk about? All right, great. So here's the quiz. Fun with net new. Who wouldn't have fun with net new? I'm going to give you 4 different case studies, and we're going to allow you to chime in. So get ready to unmute yourself, or you can do it through your chat. I want you don't answer the question, what's net new? I want you to tell us, what is the question that you have to ask to figure out if this is net new? Okay? So the first case is, we have a parts manufacturer. They make parts for lawnmowers. They're moving into your community, this parts manufacturer, and they want to serve this lawnmower assembly plant. They're going to create 10 jobs, and they're going to make this molded piece of plastic or this metal piece or whatever it is, and they're going to sell to your local lawnmower assembly plant. What are the questions you have to ask to figure out if this is really net new? Who can tell us this? And I'm going to go quiet until I hear somebody, all right? So either unmute yourself or type it into the chat.
I think I'd want to know where's the manufacturer happening now?
Yeah.
Did you guys hear
Very
that?
good. Who is that speaking?
George?
I have a whole lot of goodies in my court.
Okay, thank you. So George, thank you for that. That's perfect, right? Where are these parts currently being manufactured? Right? If they're being manufactured in your community, and this guy's going to come in and manufacture them again and sell the same thing, well, you're basically taking a little business away from the guy who's already doing it. All right, what other questions might we ask in this particular case about this part manufacturer?
Michael, I have one from Peter Throop. Are we displacing a current provider?
Yep, exactly. Are we displacing somebody else who's making it? Anything else that we should think about with this one? There's a bit of a trick question here. There's one other thing you should think about that is maybe not super obvious. So I'll just throw it out there. Maybe this guy is serving the local lawnmower assembly plant, but maybe he's also going to export. You want to ask that question. Are you making only these parts only for maybe he's going to supply the local assembly plant, but maybe he intends to distribute also across the country. You want to know that, right? All right, anything else before we move on to the next one? Okay. Case number 2. Your town's only hospital is just about to close, and it's going to build a new facility in the adjacent county. All right, so this is a negative impact. What is the negative impact to your community? And this is an example that I gave earlier, a real-life example of analysis we did. What question do we have to ask, or what questions do we have to ask about this hospital loss to know whether or not there's actually an impact on our community beyond, obviously, the hospital jobs? All right, come on, people. You got it.
What are they paying in local taxes right now, municipal taxes?
Sure, and who's speaking?
That's George.
Oh, it's George again. Okay, George. So the question, the answer was, or the question was, what are they currently paying in taxes? I'm not. How does that help you understand what's new, though? Whether or not this is a new impact, an actual impact, as opposed to just shifting things around. How does that tax question help you?
Actually, I was thinking of it from the standpoint of if the hospital closes, I was trying to think what's that net loss that I've got to try to look
right.
and offset. That was kind of my rationale.
I got you. Right. Okay. That's a good point, actually. No matter what happens, if they leave, they're not going to pay their tax revenue, assuming that they are a taxable entity. Some hospitals are, some hospitals aren't.
True.
It looks like we have a bunch of chats here. What are the chats? What do we? Anybody have a?
I have one from Elizabeth Dragon. This is taxes, and my guess from there is that the impact would be on taxes of that hospital leaving.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one we got from Peter Throop that says, will existing employees be retained? Can they work in the new facility?
Yes, this is a great one. That's exactly right. So that's one is, of the jobs that the hospital had, let's say they had 400 jobs, are these people just going to get in their cars and drive to the new location and work there as opposed to the old? Like, how much has the economy actually changed? How close is the hospital? Is it only 10 miles down the road, or is it 100 miles down the road, right? How quickly are those jobs going to actually turn over to non-community employment opportunities? So that's a very good question. What about on those? So those are the direct impacts, net new. What about things around the hospital? Anybody have any thoughts about questions we might want to ask about this move?
Yeah, like the impact on retail, restaurants, all that commerce that goes on while they're at that hospital working.
That's right. So
that's George.
Thanks, George. The way I might phrase that would be, the people who are spending, are they going to change their spending habits? Right. If there's a new hospital out in the middle of a field with nothing else around it, and these folks are going to come right back into town, or are they next to like a big population center and they're going to go to that population center, right? Anything else? What else do we have? Looks like a couple more chat bubbles coming through here.
Yeah, I have one that Michael, this is on contract service providers.
Yep. So in that particular case, we might ask ourselves, the hospital, how is the hospital currently purchasing within the community? And are they going to change that, right? Like a lot of hospitals, not a lot, but some hospitals will outsource all their linen services. So they have a local provider that comes in with a truck, grabs everything, throws it in their truck, launders it, brings it back, and gives it back to the hospital. Is the hospital going to change its service provider? If not, there's no impact to the business community, right? So these are all good examples of why we might think about this in a kind of a tough look question here. All right. Case number 3, a big new Target regional distribution center wants to locate in your industrial park. What question do you have to, and let's say it's 100 jobs, just to make, if you're not a talking point. They're going to create 100 jobs on site. What do you need? That's what they've told you. What do they need? What do you need to ask them to understand whether or not those are new jobs and what kind of economic activity you should anticipate? Okay, it looks like we have something from Jennifer. It says, will their employees need a place to live? That's a good question. So I think the first question to ask would be, who are the new employees and where will the employees live? Right? If we want to understand how new this is going to be, are these 100 jobs going to be truck drivers that go from city A to my distribution center to city B and stay at city B, right? Are they actual jobs for my community, or are they jobs someplace else and they just happen to transit through. How many of the 100 jobs are sort of these transient jobs, and how many of them are jobs actually the forklift operators and the managers and the production supervisor kind of folks on site? And you know, are they coming in from way outside the community?
Michael, another one is external shoppers attracted.
Yes, right. Well, actually, this is I know what they're getting at. If the distribution center serves a local target retailer, but this is a distribution center, it's the goods and services are coming in and out. They're not actually being sold on this site. But I could see if you're saying, like, if it's serving a target in your area that is serving people outside, then there could be something along those lines. But it's not. This is more of a distribution warehousing operation than an actual retail operation.
Another question was, what cost of community services will the new center generate that will not be covered by development? What investment will community need to make?
Sure. That one again kind of goes into the whole fiscal impacts, what the community's revenue and expenditure stream is likely to be. I want to know, like, how would that help us understand whether or not this is net new economic impacts? How would we, if we knew the answer to that information, if we knew it's going to cost an extra $50,000 in police services or fire services, how does that help us answer the question if these jobs are truly new to the community? That would be my question.
For delivery was November.
Well, then another question came about, I think that might is more than one. That is, will this will it be automated?
Hourly. So
Sure, and it sounds like we have another. It sounds like Shauna's back. There we go. Thank you. All right. So here we go. Right. So again, with those jobs, if they have a fully automated warehouse, then probably those 100 jobs are truck drivers. They're probably not actual workers in your community. So it's a good question, right? If this thing is a fully automated deal, then the only people that are actually working there are coming and going and not really sticking around. So these are all good questions. This is all good. All right. This is another one that we actually did. A local ATV club wants your county to spend $1 million to upgrade trails so that they can promote the use of ATV trails. And our question again is, what are the questions that we have to ask the ATV club to understand whether or not this investment will cause new dollars to come into the economy? What questions do we have to ask them about dollars coming in?
Yeah, will the increased tourism provide positive return on investment?
That's right. So that's the very, very first question to ask is, how much additional tourism will this actually generate? So we invest $1 million. How many people is that? How many days are they going to spend here? Right? We'd have to know that. What are the questions will we have to ask? Very similar to this question, but there's another little wrinkle to it. What do we have to know? So we know maybe they say that, we think there's going to be, 2,500 new visitor days because if we do this investment. What else do we need to know about those 2,500 visitor days? You guys are like very close here. You almost got the whole thing. What do we have to know about that? Right. Okay. So how much tourism and what is the value of those visitors? Will those visitors leave behind? Right. That was one of the comments as well. And that's right. So how much is it? Well, let's say it's 2,500 folks. How much will they leave behind? That's a good question. Now, how do we need to know that? Well, one of the things that we need to know is how much to leave behind assumes that these are not local visitors. So if we're the state of New Hampshire and you're producing a report for the state of New Hampshire, the first question you have to ask is, where are these visitors coming from? Are they coming from New Hampshire? Are they coming from outside New Hampshire? If every single one of these people that are coming in to deal with these to ride the ATVs, if they're all from New Hampshire, then exactly no dollars are coming in. If they're coming from outside, then that means they can leave money behind, as I believe Philip said that, as visitors that are coming in, spending money, and then leaving, right? Then Jennifer asked the question, what about trail limitations? Is it specific to ATVs or is it for year-round use? So that's another good question to ask. Okay, so maybe we get 2,500 ATV user days, but is there a possibility to turn this into something more? Can we get even more visitation off of this? Maybe we can we parlay this into some snowmobiling in the wintertime? And that would be additional net new that maybe the ATV club is not necessarily talking about, all right? I would throw out one other big one, and this somebody mentioned this earlier, but I just want to go back to it, is to say we need to know not only that there's 2,500 visitor days, but how much money are these, how much actual dollars are these guys spending, and what are they spending it on? Are they spending it on food? Are they spending it on lodging? Are they spending it on hotels? Are they spending it on a new sled, right? Or a part or some repairs? We want to understand what all those categories are, and that would help us establish net new. All right, so the quiz is done. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one more comment, it looks like. If I'm looking at this at the town scale, the answer might be different than looking at the state scale. It's just you have to be careful about how you define the scale of your analysis. Oh, I love that. That's exactly, you should do this webinar. That's exactly right. Right, the answer to net new depends very heavily on what geography you're talking about. In the case I just gave about the ATVing, for the state of New Hampshire, you might not have any net new visitors, but for your town, they could be 100% net new. So if you're addressing this economic impact analysis to your town, you might have a radically different result than if you're addressing this to your state legislature. So that's exactly right. We have to understand what is the geography that we're looking at. Is this the town? Is this the county? Is this the region? Is this the state? Is this the country that we want to look at? It's a great observation. All right.
I just have a quick question on that. Is that so if you're looking at it from a town scale as opposed to a regional or state scale, so even though the visitors may be from New Hampshire going to a town, the fact that say they're increasing the town population by 10% due to ATV trails, then is that a 10% increase in visitors or potential revenue as well to the community over what they have there now?
That's right. That's right. That's exactly what it is. The way I would say it, and I would never say this necessarily in the public meeting, but you could say if you make this investment and other people in New Hampshire come to your community, they're going to spend money in your community. What does that mean for the community they're leaving? That means they're going to spend less money in that community. So for the state of New Hampshire, it's a wash, but for your community, it's gain. So that's exactly it. That's right. All right. So how do we do an impact study? I'm just keeping an eye on time. I'm running a little bit over, so I apologize. I'm going to go through this quickly. How do we do an impact study? There's 3 ways to do an impact study. You can do it yourself. This is, and legitimately, it has become over the years easier and easier and easier to do this by yourself. You don't necessarily, depending on what model you use, you don't necessarily need a lot of training. You don't need a lot of sophisticated financial background. You can actually do this. And we'll talk about one of the models. And Andre, I believe you'd mentioned that the state, or was it the, who was it that has access to one of these models? I believe you mentioned this.
The state has access to MC program.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll talk about MC, EMSI, MC. If you saddled up to your state, to state licensee, and you could probably get some of these for free. All right. I'm just going to say this. You can do it yourself, and we'll talk about what you need to be able to do it yourself. Secondly, academics. There's a lot of academics out there in the economics department of this college or that college or this university that do this kind of work. And if you're lucky and you're flexible, you can find the right person and they might be able to help you out do one of these studies. Just be aware that they're professors. They don't necessarily work at the speed of business. You'd want to establish the relationship with them now, not when you need the analysis back within a week, and kind of get that going. But I've seen examples of this where people have established a good working relationship with somebody locally that, you know, in academia. And then finally, and I know this is a little self-serving, but as a consultant, we obviously do this work, and you can reach out to us. As I say here, really for anything other than the largest kind of projects and the ones that are going to, you know, get a lot of public scrutiny where you're going to need to really stand up and deliver and respond to criticism. I think that in almost all cases you can do it yourself. Just the really, really sensitive ones I think you need from an outside consultant. All right, so here are the steps you do. Step 1, you select a geography. As we just discussed, is it a single county? Is it a multiple county? Is it the entire state? And here, there's really 2 questions that you want to ask. Who's your audience, right? If you're talking to your state, if you're talking to your governor, you want to talk about the state. If you're talking to your town board, you want to talk about the county or the town. And secondly, what makes sense economically? What's your economic region, and what makes sense for that economic region? You know, if you have a big population center that spans 2 different counties, it wouldn't make sense just to get 1 county. You'd want to grab 2 counties and do that across those 2 counties. Okay, first step. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a question for Elizabeth. What is average cost for study if you hire a consultant? That's an easy response. It totally depends. I mean, it really depends what you're looking at. It's not horrible. For an economic impact study, fiscal impact studies can be very expensive because they can get very, very complicated depending on the revenue streams. Economic impact studies are not terribly complicated. And if you can collect, by the way, if you can collect the data, we'll talk about the data in just a second. If you can collect the data and transmit it to someone, it can actually be very cheap. If I don't have to go out and collect the data, you give me the data and you tell me what industry, I can drop it in my model and get a response out pretty quick. We might have to have a few discussions. We might have to figure it out, but it's really not that much work. If you do all the legwork, it's not much work for us. If we have to do it, it's expensive. I mean, it's that simple. All right, step 2, choose the software. And in some cases, depending on the software you're going to use, you might have to purchase data. If you're using the EMSI at the state, you probably wouldn't have to purchase anything, okay? Step 3 is data gathering. This is all these questions about net new. It's questions about what are the direct impacts? How many jobs are going to be located on the site? What are they going to be paid? How much total output is going to occur on the site? And then the second bullet point about earnings per worker, some models will allow you to adjust that. It's not super critical unless the business that you're dealing with is very different than every other business within the industry. The model has industry standards for each industry. If for whatever reason, if your business pays twice as much to its employees than any other business in the industry, which I don't understand how it's possible, but theoretically, if it's possible, you'd want to adjust the model, but that's rare. You don't typically have to adjust it. Step 4, you estimate those direct impacts. So now the guy said it's 100 jobs, but you think only 80% of them net new, then you say, okay, my direct impact is 80 jobs, right? And I know they're getting paid this much. One little note is if you do want to look at temporary jobs during the construction period, you have to make one conversion. That conversion is just, what are the job years? If you have 100 people constructing the building, but they're only working for half the year, that means you have 50 job years. If those same 100 people have to work 2 years, that's 200 job years. So for construction, these temporary impacts, you would put in the number of job years, not the number of jobs, okay? For permanent jobs, it's very simple. It's the final employment count. Whatever it is, that's the job in there. Step 5, you put the job change into the model, or you put the wage change into the model, or you put the sales change into the model. and you hit go. Step 6, you report the results. Okay? So again, you select your geography, you select your model, you do your questioning, and you put your direct impacts in the model and hit go. It's pretty simple. Okay, so what are the models you could use? And again, I'm going to kind of race through these. RIMS 2 is by far the cheapest. I have heard recently that the Bureau of Economic Analysis was going to actually phase out RIMS 2. I don't know if that's happened. I don't think it's happened yet. But if you're looking for very cheap models, that's a very cheap model. I'm sorry, I have another question from, do the models also look at wage levels for each job? Yes, they do. All of the models have an underlying industry template, if you will. I can't think of the term right now. Production function, they call it. That's what it is. They have a production function. And that includes things like output per worker and earnings per worker. So the model will assume if you're in the parts manufacturing business, steel or whatever it is, rolled steel or whatever, like a typical worker in that industry gets paid X dollars. Therefore, if you have 100 new jobs, 100 times X is the wages. And again, you can adjust that if there's something specific to your project that's very unusual. All right, so RIMS, very cheap. They just give you a list of multipliers. You do the math, okay? It's not super sophisticated. There's a couple of tricks that the other models do that this model doesn't do, because it's literally you have to do the spreadsheet work, but it gives you the multiplier. Good for ballparking. IMPLAN is one that's probably the best known. Created in Minnesota. It's kind of the granddaddy. A lot of the academics use it just because they've been around for a long time. I feel that the data is better than RIMS 2. It's definitely better. The data in general is better. It does more of the work for you. You enter in a few figures, you hit a button, a couple of buttons, and you get through to the output page. You don't have to do the spreadsheet work. It would require some level of training. If you're adept and if you're a self-starter, you can get the manual and probably figure it out, or they do trainings that they allow you to do. REMI, I'm going to skip REMI because it's just a very expensive, very complicated model. I don't use it. I think it's too complicated for most analyses unless you're working for the Federal Reserve or something like that. So I'm not going to talk about that. And then finally, the one that we used to use IMPLAN. We now use EMSI. It's the same one that Andre was talking about at the state level. It also uses the Stevens technique, which I won't go into. It's just about how industry, it's called cross-hauling, but it's sort of a high sophistication model. And by the way, if you do get access to an MC subscription, it has great data. In addition to economic impact analysis, it has great data about industries and occupations and historic employment trends and projections in the future. You can do a lot of cool stuff with the tool. So if someone you know has access to it, you should just poke around and see what it is. The advantage that we see more than anything else for MC is it's very easy, and you can use NAICS codes. Everybody uses NAICS codes now. IMPLAN kind of has its own thing. But you can use NAICS codes, which means you can get right down to the very specific industry category that you might be looking at. And they also allow you to go to a bit smaller geography, even down to a zip code, if you want to get that specific. Okay. I know we're basically running out of time. So while I'm doing this, if you have questions, even if it's not related to the slide, just shoot them right now, and we'll take them as we go here. Just a few data things that you should be aware of. Agricultural industries are typically very hard to model. The data behind is very poor. There's not good reporting. Now, that's not value added. If you're talking about a dairy, like a cheese making plant, that's very good data. If you're talking about farming, the data can be kind of so-so. Really difficult, actually, I would say. Low density, I'm talking about extremely low density areas. Rural areas we deal with all the time. But when we're talking about wilderness, like we have the Adirondack Park. In the middle of the Adirondack Park, there's just not a whole lot going on. You're not going to get good results. I know in northern New Hampshire, there's I can't think of the name of the region up there, but where it's very, very, very sparsely populated, that would be difficult. But pretty much anywhere else in New Hampshire, I think you'd be okay. Super capital intensive industries, you have to watch out for. Their multipliers can be really high, and you kind of have to know what you're talking about. I'm talking about like a semiconductor manufacturing plant where their multiplier might be 5 times jobs, right? Just be a little careful with those. And then, unfortunately, and I would love for this not to be the case, but if you have like a brand new technology coming on that doesn't even have a NAICS code anymore, it's hard to model that. You just have to find something that is close enough, and that works, okay? So with that, I'm at the end of the presentation. We only have a couple minutes left here, and unfortunately, I do have to run. I actually have a meeting I got to get to in just a few minutes, but I'd be glad we have a few more minutes. If there's anybody else that wants to know, hey, I ran into this, how would I deal with that? Or this is a particular situation that happened in our community, how might someone tackle that? Or we had this interesting case study, I'd be happy to talk about any of those things or examples from your community of where you did this. Anything that anybody would like to talk about.
Michael, actually, I'll start out with a question because one of the things that one of the tools that New Hampshire has available to, which other communities use and other states as well, it's called a tax increment finance district. And yes. Oftentimes with TIF districts, you're looking at how much existing development has occurred in there and how much potential development it will incur in there, and therefore the economic impact analysis, if we can, I guess, utilize some of the projected development type that could go in there in order to determine, if obviously the revenue that's going to come in as a result of the TIF be enough to take care of the infrastructure there. Are those types of analysis that you get into, or that the economic impact analysis can help with?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so glad you did that, because I neglected to mention one kind of important one to model. So if I were doing a TIF district, and a lot of times where we've seen TIF districts is when you're trying to do particularly like a hard project or an adaptive reuse, or maybe you have a section of town that needs to be, reanimated, that kind of thing. And a lot of times you'll get mixed use development in those areas for TIF districts, right? Not always, but sometimes you do. One of the most powerful things to bring to bear in the public discussion is about household spending. And how do you model household spending? And so it's very similar to the tourism case. If you're going to say, look, we know that if we build this thing in our community, then we're going to get 100 new residents that maybe work in the Boston Metro, for example, right? But they're willing to live up here, or maybe this is their second home, for example. They're willing to live up here, and they would not be in our community unless this project happens, right? Well, here's what you do. You say, okay, tell me what these people spend on rent, food, doctor's visits, legal counseling services, entertainment, the whole household goods, all the retail shop. Like, give me that profile. And you can get that profile from the federal government, from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. So you say, okay, we know that a household that makes $70,000, that they spend X dollars on household goods. Well, you find the NAICS code that's associated with household goods retailing, and you put it in there. You tie the amount of spending on whatever the category is on groceries. You find the grocery store NAICS code, you put it into there. And what you can do at the end of the day is to say, okay, if we have 100 new households and we know that they're each spending X dollars, well, now we have $10 million that's being spent in our community that we know would not be there. These people are not coming to community without this project. Then you can model those out. And that's actually quite interesting. You can get not only what the direct jobs are, but what the associated jobs in your community might be. So great question. And I think we had another chat. Which model would best serve on a regional basis? Really, this is from Richard. Richard, any of the models will work at a regional level. They all will work at a county, multiple county or state level. There's only a couple models, the MC model, that will go down to the zip code level. So you're fine on a regional basis. All of the models are gonna cover that. It works great if it follows a county boundary. If it doesn't, and you need to be like really specific outside of a county boundary, then you can get down to the zip code level and aggregate all the zip codes that make up the region that you want to look at. But it's easiest if you look at counties. That's just the way that the feds collect the data. Great. Anything else?
I don't see any other questions coming up. Oh, here we go. We got something from Peter. Can you see that?
Sure. How accurate are these models? With smaller scale analysis, is sample size big enough? This gets into those low density rural areas, very low density rural areas. That's my concern, is that the accuracy of the model could be way off. I find in even moderately dense areas, and I'm not talking about urban areas, I'm talking about even moderately dense rural areas where you have maybe a couple of villages and a couple population centers and a few, different, like maybe industrial parks or something like that. I think it's reasonably accurate. The old-fashioned way of doing these things wasn't modeling it. It was actually going out to these individual places and asking them, what do you spend your money on and where do you buy it? Like, it's literally like a paper clipboard survey thing. The modeling helps you get around that. If you're really concerned, you can go the old route and literally go talk to the manufacturer and say, how much do you buy of this service? How much do you buy of this service? How much do you buy of this service? And where do you buy it right now? And where will you buy it in the future? And so if it's really important, you can actually do it old school. Okay. So a population of 5,000 to 6,000 could be reasonably accurate. I think so, yeah. I think 5,000 or 6,000 is fine. If you're talking about, a county that only has a couple thousand across the whole county, I mean, that is getting, if you're talking about is that a county level that you're looking at, or are you looking at a state level? I mean, looking at a town. Okay, at a town level, that's fine. If you have 5,000 across an entire county, that's getting pretty sparse. Within a single town, I think you're okay. Great. And unfortunately, I do have to run because I do have an 11 o'clock. I got to jump on, which is just unfortunate. I was out of my control. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate, as always, the opportunity to be in front of folks. And I'd be happy if you have questions that are burning, you want to get the answer to, and we don't have time now, get them to Andre, and he can get them to me, and I'd be happy to respond. So thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciate you joining us again this year. Have a good day.
You're welcome. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Before I let everybody go, I just want to reiterate that our second speaker is taken ill, so he will not be with us today. But I have rescheduled him for November 18th, our last session. He will be the opening session from 9 to 10 before we get into the project presentations. So he does apologize, but the flu bug got him. So anyways, also today we should have opened up on the Moodle site the last homework assignment, which is pretty much wrapping up, pulling pieces together for your project. So you'll have some, you have over a month to actually up until the last session, 2 days before the last session, to get that done. And hopefully you all have received comments back from the staff here, the team here, with regard to your projects. And if you have any follow-up questions, please get them in. And other than that, I wish everybody a great weekend. And also, if there's any questions along the way, please shoot them my way. All right, y'all take care.
Thanks.